Well, hey there! This video will serve as a primer for my 29-point story structure film theory. I've called it Hollywood's storytelling secret in the past, and I stand by that title. It has appeared in literally 100% of the movies and season-long television that I've watched. I breezed through these structure segments really quickly during the actual breakdown videos. However, here I will go into further detail about each segment and what it does. I'll include a brief example or two for each. And since that's exactly what you're here for, let's get started. The first point in every movie is called a conflicted protagonist. We start with a narrow focus on our main character, specifically highlighting their overall personality, their current situation, and also touching on their inner conflict. Take Mean Girls as the example. This is when Katie's personality is on full display during her opening voiceover. She explains her situation as being a new student from a different continent, which alludes to her inner conflict of finding a place to belong. Any prologue material counts as highlighting the protagonist's situation, like in The Fifth Element, when the aliens make preparations for the approach of evil. This directly relates to the situation Corbin Dallas will be in. The second point in every movie is called the status quo. Here, we take a step back from the protagonist and show that they really do not fit into their situation. They contrast against the world in very specific ways. And in this segment, we touch on the where, why, and how of their conflicted existence. You will normally find both of the external and internal conflicts represented. In fact, the internal aspect of the protagonist that we find here is always directly related to the climax of the movie. If you want to predict the ending of a film with any degree of accuracy, your best clues can be found in this segment. Take the menu as our example. This is when Margot doesn't fit in with the bougie foodie etiquette of these wealthy diners. It foreshadows why the chef will let her leave the restaurant and save herself. Also, she's uncomfortable treating the waitstaff like objects, further distancing herself from the elite. Now, I just want to take a moment and point out that these first two segments, a conflicted protagonist and the status quo, are actual sequences. As in, they play out over numerous minutes, and they can include several scenes. These sequences make up 24 of the 29 points in this structure. The remaining 5 points are brief moments in the movie, which don't normally last longer than 60 seconds on screen. The first of these is called a brand new something. This is your college professor's classic inciting incident of the story. Basically, a brief event happens that's never happened before. Whatever it is, it will lead all the characters away from their personal status quos. Let's turn to Cruella. This is when young Estella watches her mother get pushed over a cliff. Without a doubt, everything changes for our main character in this moment. In your average movie, this usually happens right around the 10-minute mark, but not always. The science fiction and fantasy genres normally have extended beginnings because there's usually more world building needed at the start. So their brand new somethings occur later than 10 minutes. Let's return to The Fifth Element. This is when Lilu crashes through the roof of Corbin Dallas's cab. Without a doubt, everything changes for our main character in this moment, and it doesn't happen until 32 minutes in. The fourth point in every movie is called old versus new. We touch upon what we already learned in the first two sequences. However, we do this for the specific purpose of examining how the brand new something has caused change. This is our first measure of progress in the story. By revisiting the external and internal conflicts from the status quo, we create a sense of forward momentum through change. which was directly brought about by the brand new something. Take Fight Club as our example. Following his first confrontation with Marla, this is when the narrator reverts to his inability to sleep at night. He also begins to find modern society as pretentious and dumb, which is a sudden contrast to the collector of adorable things he was. Also, let's look at Bahubali. Following the appearance of the wooden mask, this is when Senga finds momentary happiness that her son has stopped climbing waterfalls. He, on the other hand, has only become more obsessed with what lives at the top and reaches higher than he ever dreamed possible. Now, I just want to take a moment and refer to a more traditional storytelling model, Dan Harmon's Story Circle. There's a link in the description below if you'd like a primer on that. Everything we've covered so far fits neatly inside the first segment, the You segment. What follows will fit neatly in the Need segment. The fifth point in every movie is called Something's Amiss. One of two things happens here, though usually both together. The characters either discover that something is very wrong about their post-something new situation, or if they already suspected something was wrong, then they will explore just how badly things really are, if not likely to get even worse. Take O Brother Where Art Thou for this example. This is when our boys on the run discover that everything seems to be 2 weeks away, yet they have to be at their treasure in 4 days. Oh no. Then discord grows steadily worse among the trio, an ominous sign of things to come. Oh no. The sixth point in every movie is called a clarified objective. This is similar to your college professor's call to arms scene. The protagonist, and sometimes another character or two, will dedicate themselves toward a specific goal. However, the goal is never the movie's climax. The goals stated here are always smaller in scale and or narrower in scope than what we'll see in the third act. In fact, this sequence plays directly into another segment, which happens after the midpoint of the story. We'll get there shortly. Let's look to The Big Lebowski. This is when the dude tries to embrace balance and comfort in his life. He somewhat achieves this later when he finds his car again, but the balance is not true without the rug. Also, this is when he's given the mission to deal with Bunny's kidnappers. He somewhat achieves this when a homework assignment leads him to the missing ransom money, but the kidnappers are still unpaid. The seventh point in every movie is called Set the Stage. Simply put, we charge through a gauntlet of story elements that are critical to the rest of the story. It's almost like a checklist of the memes and vibes of the movie. Take Captain America Winter Soldier as our example. This is when Nick Fury starts to assemble a trusted crew, which is what Steve Rogers will struggle with. Also, we get a sizable taste of the well-connected conspiracy that will play a central role moving forward. High-tech action and explosions are a recurring theme, so you can find them here as well. And, of course, the semi-titular character himself, Bucky Winter Soldier Barnes, makes his appearance. The eighth point is another 60-second moment on screen, called The Story Begins. This wraps up the first act of the movie with a dramatic punch, and it launches our characters into the wild jungle of the second act. I've seen another writer refer to this as the oh shit moment, because the goal is to make either your characters or audience think exactly that. Oh shit. Take RoboCop as our perfect example. This is when our main character, Officer Murphy, is executed point blank by Clarence. If you want to know how effective of an oh shit moment this was, check out a few reaction videos. Now, the wording here might seem odd. For the average movie, we're about a half hour in, so you could argue this is not the beginning of the story. In terms of storytelling, however, everything we've seen up to this point has been set up. The true character journey begins here. The 9th point is called Enter New Territory. Just like in traditional storytelling structures, this is when our protagonists and characters venture into the unknown, albeit literal or figurative. Dan Harmon labeled this segment of his story circle as Go, further emphasizing the theme of movement or momentum or needed progress. But there's more to it than that. This sequence also introduces the rules of this new journey and also the expectations upon our characters if they hope to succeed. And of course, everything they experience is directly related to the story that's about to unfold. Take Iron Man as our example. This is when Tony and Yinsen build the first suit in guarded secrecy, which is a rule Tony will impose upon himself for the rest of the franchise. Yinsen shoulders more of the mission than he can handle and puts his life in danger, and this places the expectation upon Tony to protect those who help him, sometimes from themselves. And finally, the prototype takes its first steps, creating a cycle of learning and evolving. The 10th point is called Positive Progress. It's fairly self-explanatory, really, in that this sequence always features our characters growing and adapting to their new adventure. However, the focus is always on the physical beats of the story. What I mean by that is it never deals with the emotional state of any character. Let's use Happy Gilmore as our example. This is when Happy proudly dedicates himself to being a tournament golfer. He refuses a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to enrich himself and keeps to the mission of saving his grandma's house. We also check in with Grandma and confirm that saving her home is indeed possible. Now, this sequence is the only one that alters itself based on genre. Or more specifically, when it comes to horror movies, this sequence is flipped on its head. The villain is given the positive progress in the story as a way to further stack the deck against our characters. Take Get Out as the perfect example of this alteration. This is when Missy first hypnotizes Chris, when she places him under her control. And although Chris becomes very emotional in this scene, the physical beat belongs to Missy, because she gains external control of the situation. The 11th point is called Test the Resolve. Here, our characters become rattled, or else we, the audience, should feel a sense of ominous doom. Hurdles and information and character dynamics create reasons for everyone involved to question everything. Convictions, agendas, and desires are tested, and it's not always a good thing for a character to pass their test. Take Joker as our example. This is when Arthur steps on stage and delivers a cringeworthy performance, one which we expect to lead to his brutal humiliation. Without knowing it during our first watch-through, Arthur is descending into a delusion thanks to his lack of medication. Nothing can be trusted from here on out. After this point, we enter the Search segment of Dan Harmon's Story Circle. The 12th point is called Trials and Tribulations. Action scenes naturally fit into this sequence, since it's merely an escalation of complications that all the characters need to deal with. It can usually be identified by contained chaos. However, in more dialogue-oriented storytelling, this is when drama gets turned up to 11. Let's look to RRR for the action example. This is when Raju takes on the entire British aristocracy in that Oscar-winning dance-off, and he turns their women against them. He and Beam are outnumbered and surrounded by a violent enemy, yet make it out alive by the pulse-pounding exhaustion of their dance. Diametrically opposed to that, take Ma Rainey's Black Bottom. This is when Levy Green reveals his emotional backstory. All the pain and anguish of his character bubbles to the surface, and he explodes. The 13th point is called Adaptation. Usually an extension of Trials and Tribulations, This is when our characters make their internal evolution. Contrasted to the earlier positive progress, which was all about physical beats, adaptation is focused on the emotional or internal progress of the protagonist, or other important characters. Take the unbearable weight of massive talent as our example. This is when Vivian learns to roll with Nick's panic, leading him through his own escape and rescue. It's her trust in Nick's basic instincts that finally leads the team to some manner of success. Then she leverages his guilt against him to keep him in the mission. The 14th point is called Distorted Reflections. This is another sequence that is devoted to the examination of story elements. In Old versus New, this is what we did. We examined some things from before the brand new something, and used them to get a sense of forward momentum. Distorted Reflections performs the same function. However, this sequence refers back to the entirety of the first act. Everything up to and including the oh shit moment can be revisited here, but it's always to demonstrate the growth and progress in the story so far. Take Cruella as a perfect example. This is when Estella and crew perform the heist, which is pretty much just a cheeky remix of the beginning of the movie, when Estella accidentally crashed the Baroness's party. Another wonderful example is Bahubali. This is when he prevents an enormous statue from crashing to the ground, showing how much stronger he's become since carrying the idol. The Mahishmati people chant Bahubali's true name, contrasting against his adopted mother chanting the name she gave him. Devasena stands tall and proud, showing what kind of strength she derives from her true son's return. And then Senga orders the cave to be uncovered, undoing her Act 1 command in a desperate bid to find and rescue her adopted son. The 15th point is another 60-second moment on screen called the one-way gate. This is the core of the movie, the truth of the story and how it resonates with the protagonist specifically. Oftentimes, this moment strikes directly at their inner conflict or their core wound. But even when it's a physical or external beat, the foundational message is the same. The characters have reached a point of no return. Take Prey as our example. This is when our protagonist finally lays eyes upon the unknown animal that she's been tracking. It's proof that she was right, and also proof that she is vastly out of her league. Either way, there's no turning back from here. Everything that happens after this moment belongs to the Find segment in Dan Harmon Story Circle. The 16th point is called the Hard Truths. Normally related to the one-way gate, this sequence expands upon honest discovery. We receive absolute truths about the internal conflict of the protagonist, and also absolute truths about the external journey of the story. Take the Blair Witch Project as our example. This is when the film crew stumbles upon the patch of stick figure men, confirming for them, and us, that the Blair Witch lives nearby. Whatever internal skepticism they had died right here. And for their external journey, this is also when they resign themselves to truly being lost in the woods. The 17th point is called an empty victory. Finally, we have arrived at the sequence I promised earlier when we covered a clarified objective. The goal which the characters dedicated themselves to is always achieved here, in a manner of speaking. While they can celebrate a win, they cannot claim a full victory. Why not? Because their current win is hollow without an additional victory, which is what finally sets up the characters to aim at the movie's climax. Let's return to Captain America Winter Soldier for our example. This is when Steve Rogers and Natalia Romanoff finally tease out the depth of the conspiracy, which was their clarified objective earlier. However, they lack the resources to stop the conspiracy, for now. Also, this is when Sam Wilson volunteers to help, finally finding his sense of purpose. However, for Steve, it's yet another ally putting their life on the line, ratcheting up the number of people he needs to protect. a clear hint to the tension of the climax. The 18th point is called Ordeal, Death, Rebirth. Not the most creative title, but that's exactly what happens here. Our characters face a conflict or hurdle that is rather existential in nature. Usually, the physical journey or the mission is nearly compromised, but the conflict can also come from an important character's sense of self or identity. No matter if it centers around the external or internal aspects of the story, the structure is always the same. The conflict introduces the ordeal. It rapidly spins out of control in death, then is sidestepped entirely in rebirth. Take Fight Club as our most iconic example. This is when the narrator tries and fails to blackmail his boss. That's the ordeal part. Then he begins kicking his own ass into a bloody mess. Why is this the death part? Because in the voiceover, he explains that he can feel the wall that separates he and Tyler Durden beginning to crumble. This fight is threatening to leave him truly unhinged. But then the rebirth part happens when security barges into the room and interrupts the whole thing. Everything after this moment belongs to the take segment of Dan Harmon Story Circle. The 19th point is called Reward Seizing the Sword. And pretty much it's just a sequence full of winning. It's directly related to the rebirth part of the previous sequence, though it normally plays out over numerous scenes, not just one. Usually. Let's return to O Brother Where Art Thou for a great example. This is when Everett and Delmar rescue Pete from lockup, saving him from torture. And this leads Everett to pull down his mask and be honest for possibly the first time in his life. The 20th point is called A Heavy Price. Your college professor probably referred to this as a great sacrifice, that the protagonist needs to lose something in order to continue on. And that's part of it, but there's more than that. Not only do the characters suffer a grand loss, but there's a specific reason why. It's because they cannot quit or turn around or surrender any longer. They are forced to endure great hardships, not to allow them to move forward, but because they are entirely unwilling to move backward. That last bit is the key. Even if they physically could surrender, they cannot do so internally. Take the Big Lebowski as our example. This is when the dude gives away the location of the ransom money to the last person he should have. Crap. And what's worse, his drink of choice, a White Russian, is drugged and used to double-cross him. Double crap. The 21st point is called Chaos Reigns. Like old versus new and distorted reflections earlier, this sequence is all about revisiting previous story elements. But this time, everything is on the table, even if it was just introduced moments earlier. This is a free-fall. Every story element that is revisited is done so for the express purpose of throwing the characters into upheaval. Tension is ramped up, emotions fracture, and everything is on fire. Not always literally. Let's return to RRR for our example. This is when Raju's mysterious past is finally revealed, and it explains every questionable decision he's made since the start. Then his undercover freedom fighter status is put to the test when he's forced to publicly whip his best friend. Chaos. The 22nd point is another 60-second moment on screen called All Hope is Lost. It wraps up the second act with an emotional gut punch. Simply put, something robs our protagonist of any hope for success, or so it appears. Let's return to Iron Man for the perfect example. This is when Obadiah Stane launches the manufacture of his own suit, Ironmonger, and with it he'll have everything he needs to finally kill Tony Stark. Everything that happens after this moment in regards to Dan Harmon Story Circle belongs to the Return segment. The 23rd point is called the Rough Road Back. Here, the characters come to terms with the defeat they just received. The characters rally themselves. Even if some of them want to give up, They face the reality that they can never return to who they were or where they were in the first act. Take Home Alone as one great example. This is when two seasoned criminals finally descend upon the McAllister home, knowing full well that an 8-year-old is all by himself. Kevin must overcome his Act 1 helplessness and defend his home. Another example comes from the Blair Witch Project. Following the overnight disappearance of Josh, this is when Heather and Mike try to continue on without him. But they're still lost in the woods, and that night, Josh can be heard screaming in the distance. They're no longer hunting the witch, but being hunted. The 24th point is called Return to the Familiar. Much like Chaos Reigns, this is a sequence that revisits any and all story elements up to this point. However, this is not about a freefall or chaos. The characters are pushing toward the climax of the movie, and these scenes are all about satisfying callbacks and payoffs and running gags and even loose thread mysteries. Take Happy Gilmore as our example. This is when the immense love and dedication he's shown his grandmother is returned as she delivers a calming pep talk. Happy finds his happy place again, a recurring theme, and then he settles into tournament play, which has been the bulk of the movie so far. The 25th point is called Bring It Home. This is the final gauntlet, the messy road that leads directly to the climax. Side characters will find their conclusions here, if applicable, but always, 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 the protagonist charges forward to conclude theirs. Let's return to Joker for our example. This is when Arthur steps out in front of a riveted audience, and he's given all the attention he craves. In the span of 10 minutes, however, he devolves into his psychosis. Arthur showed up to commit suicide, but it will be the Joker who leaves a murderer. And the final 60-second moment on screen is called the climax. The protagonist finally resolves their internal conflict, and they overcome their Act 1 status quo. Take Mean Girls as our example. This is when Katie sacrifices her high school popularity to save everyone from the consequences of the burn book. It's a decision she should have made before losing sight of her old self. Everything after this moment in terms of Dan Harmon Story Circle belong to the Changed segment. The 27th point is called Resurrection. The characters pick themselves up from the rubble of the fight, and they reflect upon the situation. This is when they exchange weary smiles, realizing their full victory. Well, about half the time. The other half the time, this sequence winds down the action of the third act. If the external conflict carries on longer than the protagonist's climax, then this is usually when it's wrapped up. Let's return to Ma Rainey's Black Bottom for our reflection example. Following the wrongful stabbing of Toledo, this is when Levy snaps back to reality. He watches his bright future dissolve in his arms, reflecting upon every mistake he made up to this point. For a winding down the action example, let's look to Captain America Winter Soldier. Following Steve's attempt to sacrifice himself for the greater good, this is when Black Widow hurts herself to let Nick Fury kill Pierce and end the conspiracy. Then those two rescue Sam Wilson from a building collapse. And finally, all this is enough to break through Bucky's conditioning. The 28th point is called Return with the Elixir. This is when side characters receive their farewell from the story. We get a peek at each of them after the journey, and always in contrast against their own status quos from the start. Take the menu as our example. Following Margot's departure from the restaurant, this is when our doomed ensemble of characters are turned into human s'mores. Quite a humiliating ending for people who showed up as though VIPs among servants. The 29th and final point is called a changed protagonist. Much like the previous sequence, this is when we contrast our main character against how we met them at the opening, or characters if it's an ensemble. It's common to refer to this as making the story rhyme, but I dislike that analogy because I think what's more important is what's different, not the same. To me, the contrast between this sequence and the very first one is what gives a sense of satisfaction. And the more these two sequences look the same or rhyme with each other, it demonstrates visually how little the protagonist actually grew. Take the first Pirates of the Caribbean movie as an example. Will and Elizabeth are drastically different than their introductions. He is a confident pirate instead of a timid blacksmith apprentice. And together, they're in love as opposed to being single and miserable. Even Jack Sparrow is given command of an elite pirate ship to contrast against the dinghy he sank. These are all huge differences that highlight great change. Whereas in Ocean's 11, there's very little change and very little growth. Danny walks out of jail and is greeted by Rusty. Sure, his wife is somewhere waiting for him in the parking lot, but that's her change, not his. Danny almost perfectly rhymes from start to finish, showing how very little is actually better for him. And that concludes the primer. With this in mind, hopefully the movie breakdowns are a little more understandable. And also, hopefully, each breakdown video will help explain the nuances of the 29-point story structure better than any primer video could. If you have any additional questions, please let me know down in the comments. I'll rewrite this video if I need to and clear up any lingering confusion, but we'll see how things go first. Thank you so much, and I'll talk at you next time.